As we transition from football to college basketball for the next month, I'm going to do something different in this episode. Connecticut won a national title in dominant fashion last year, and my numbers suggest that Dan Hurley's team will contend again in 2024. My name is Ed Fang, your host for the Football Analytics Show. In this episode, I'm going to read you a chapter about Danny Hurley. It's from The Miracle of St. Anthony's by Adrian Wojnarowski, and it tells the unbelievable story of how Danny's dad, Bob, became a high school coaching legend. There's one chapter on Danny, and I think it's great. Before we dig in, let me tell you a few things so the story makes sense. The book was published in 2005, and Dan is the coach at St. Benedict's Prep, a boarding high school in New Jersey. You probably know about his brother Bobby, a superstar and national title winner at Duke. Melissa is their sister, and Chris is their mom. Let's get into it. Danny Hurley was going down, and he was going down hard. All hell was breaking loose at the state prep school championship game with Lawrenceville drilling St. Benedict's. And he had decided that he'd be damned if he was going to go out like the referees tried to send him. He had been tossed for screaming, "You're awful," to an official. And the more he started to think about that, standing in the corridor outside the gym at South Brunswick High School, the more unacceptable it had become. If the old man's kid was going down in a championship game, he was going down like a Hurley, throwing haymakers. It kept getting worse by the minute. One of his assistant coaches had been ejected, and his star player, J.R. Smith, had fouled out and lobbed one of his sneakers into the stands. And the worst of it was still the end zone dance Lawrenceville Prep was doing on St. Benedict's dream of a third state prep school title in his 3 seasons on the job. Danny Hurley was 6'2", with wide-rimmed glasses and a charming, cynical disposition that his coaching friend Bob Lanier described as Richard Lewis with a clipboard, a reference to the self-tormenting comedian. On this late February Sunday afternoon, Danny was angry and embarrassed and had become more like his old man growing up than anyone could have believed possible. "This is a farce," Chris Hurley yelled out of the stands. Her husband dipped his head, tugging on the brim of his baseball cap and casting a wary eye at the court. The moment the elder Hurley had ascended the bleachers late in the first quarter, every eye in the section seemed to follow him. He was still the standard by which they judged his son's work. And once everything began to unravel, Bob wanted to go down on the floor, scoop up his son, and spare him the indignity of leaving in such shambles what had been such a spectacular season. Nonetheless, it wasn't over, because there was no way a Hurley went down without the last word. So Danny stepped back inside the doorway of the gymnasium, turned to the 2 game officials beneath the basket, and took them on one at a time. "You're an ass," he yelled at one. "And you're a little troll," he said, pointing to the second. Before he could work his way to the third member of the officiating crew, a South Brunswick policeman stepped up to him with a warning. "Another word, you're leaving in cuffs," he said. What a disaster. A 29-1 season finished in a wreck beyond recognition. His mother was on the cell phone to Melissa describing the scene, and through it all, nobody seemed to notice the teenager walking back and forth behind the St. Benedict's bench, wearing a Duke number 11 jersey. It was fitting. The jersey was the result of a business deal that Bobby tried to bring Danny into with him. To capitalize on the throwback jersey craze, a company offered to share the proceeds with Duke and Bobby. Bobby worked out an agreement whereby the company had to give Danny $1,000 to release his old Seton Hall University jersey, number 15, for sale too. Bobby was still looking out for his little brother, but Danny told him to keep the money and, in turn, he'd keep his pride. No way did he want to start walking into Jersey shopping malls and see those unsold Seton Hall jerseys on the bargain rack, dropping from 20% off to 30 to 50 and on down. "Whatever money I would have pocketed," Danny laughed, "I'd rather hold on to my last piece of dignity." It was never easy being Danny Hurley. He had won 2 straight prep school championships since taking over at St. Benedict's in 2001, and yet the whispers walking out of the gym were predictable. Danny Hurley sure wasn't Bob Hurley. The internet message boards lit up the next day. Anonymous postings insisting that his father never would have lost a title game like that. Danny was 29-2 for the season, having won tournaments in 3 states, and now 75-12 in his 3 years at St. Benedict's. His kids were getting scholarships, his program was beating the best in the country, and it still didn't matter. Whatever Danny Hurley had done in his basketball career, it would never be enough for some people. He wasn't Bob now, and he wasn't Bobby then. He spent his entire childhood fighting for his own identity in the shadow of his older brother. Bobby was one of a kind, one of the most popular players in modern college basketball history, the All-American and Final Four MVP every small white kid believed he could become. Bobby's story was a fairy tale. Danny couldn't be Bobby any more than any kid in America could be him. Eventually, people had to shake their heads and wonder if Danny was just some sort of basketball masochist. After all his struggles, what did he decide to do? Become a high school basketball coach in northern Jersey. The first time I saw Danny coach, it reminded me of Bob when Bob first started out, Chris Hurley says. Bob has mellowed out a lot, but Danny still has that youthful living and dying with every play. Danny Hurley was the class clown, the bohemian, Sister Allen says. He was the wisecracker in the back of the room, causing everyone else to lose it while he kept a straight face. Jerry Walker, the St. Anthony's and Seton Hall star, always believed that Danny had more natural ability than Bobby, but just never worked like him. Truth be told, Danny grew up watching Bobby sacrifice his childhood and decided that it wasn't for him. He was 2 years younger, a sophomore when Bobby was a senior and playing point guard for one of the greatest high school teams in history. He was 2 inches taller and left-handed, more of a shooter than a playmaker. Danny had a magnificent high school career, one of the best in state history, but it wasn't Bobby's. Bobby had been 115-5, winning 4 state titles, a national championship, and at the end of his senior year, earning co-MVP of the McDonald's All-American game with Shaquille O'Neal. Bobby always viewed himself as the best player on the court, whereas I always felt like the little brother, Danny says. I was always being compared to him, but Bobby was Bobby. There were no comparisons to him. He was just Bobby Hurley, great guard at St. Anthony's. All people did was compare my game with him. And you can say that you don't pay attention to that stuff, but as a 14 or 15-year-old, of course you do. It took a lot of self-confidence from me. When Danny was a junior at St. Anthony's, Bobby was a freshman bringing Duke to the Final Four. As a St. Anthony's senior, Danny missed a three-pointer at the buzzer in his father's only Tournament of Champions defeat in school history. It was a difficult shot, rimming in and out, and St. Anthony's had been underdogs in the title game. Danny had done a remarkable job to keep the Friars in the game, but it was typical. St. Anthony's finished his senior season 31-1 and number 2 in the country. Bobby had been 32-0 and number 1 as a senior. For anyone else, it would have been an amazing career. For Danny Hurley, well, it wasn't Bobby. Danny had an offer to play for Duke, but nobody in the family believed it would be a wise choice. He picked Seton Hall, where 2 of his old St. Anthony's teammates from Bobby's class, Terry DeHare and Jerry Walker, had stayed close to home to play for Coach P.J. Carlesimo. From the beginning, Danny had a hard time at Seton Hall. Bobby had turned into a college matinee idol at Duke. Danny struggled just to get minutes on the floor as a freshman. Everywhere Seton Hall traveled in the Big East, the chants were relentless. Bobby's better. Bobby's better. And it wore Danny down. Eventually, he still preferred the road torment over the Seton Hall home games in the 20,000-seat Meadowlands Arena. It was one thing to get taunted by opposing fans, but when the Seton Hall faithful turned on Danny, it floored him and his family. It got so bad that Chris Hurley would settle into her seat, with a routine announcement to the potential tormentor's intersection. I'm Dan Hurley's mother. It was a declaration that everyone had better watch their mouth. Bob stopped sitting in the stands altogether, choosing instead to stand in one of the portals to the lower bowl of the arena, just to keep from punching people out. I never imagined that adults could be that angry about the sport, Danny says. Playing in the New York, New Jersey area is hard because they treat the colleges like the pros. They're not real forgiving. The media was tough too. This wasn't Bobby getting covered in the Durham paper where it was just, well, the kid gave it the old college try. This was the pro mentality, and that was tough to deal with. After Danny had arrived on Seton Hall's campus outside Newark in the fall of 1991, he would regret not moving into the upperclassmen dormitories with Walker and DeHare. He ended up living with the freshmen, spending far too many nights out drinking. And when he wasn't an immediate star at Seton Hall, everything started spiraling for him. If Bobby had a bad game, Danny knew, he would come back to campus, turn on the lights in the gym, and take 400 extra shots. Danny would come back, close his door, and lose himself in self-loathing. There was just something about his mental makeup that was different than me, Danny says. He just had a tunnel vision that I didn't have. His Seton Hall teammates started to worry about his drinking, the worst of it coming one night when those dollar drafts turned into Danny smashing a campus golf cart into a concrete wall. At the beginning of his sophomore season in December 1993, there was an afternoon-evening doubleheader at Madison Square Garden, featuring St. John's and Seton Hall in the afternoon and the Knicks and Sacramento Kings in the evening. Bobby played for the Kings. Hurley night at the Garden. Just what I needed at the time, Danny recalls. He played dismally, missing all 6 of his shots, and told Bobby later that night that he couldn't breathe anymore. He had stopped going to class, stopped returning calls to close friends, stopped leaving his room for anything but basketball practice. Bobby, I'm done, Danny told him. I'm packing it in. In the days after the Garden doubleheader, Danny's world turned darker. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't go out for anything but basketball practice. He felt like he was on the brink of a breakdown. As much as he could, Danny had steered clear of contact with his parents, especially his father. He didn't want Bob Hurley to see his son the way he had become depressed and demoralized. The players his father had sent away to college were always calling him with problems, but Danny didn't dare. It would have been tough for him to see me so weak, Danny says. Bobby had always been his protector, and he always regretted missing the warning signs of Danny's spiral. Bobby felt such guilt over never truly understanding the burden of being his big brother. As much as Bobby believed that he had been there for Danny, it wasn't until the aftermath of his own car crash, inevitable drags from lottery pick to journeyman guard, that forced Bobby to see the world through his brother's eyes. A diminished Bobby Hurley discovered what it was like to chase the legend of a young Bobby Hurley, something that Danny had done most of his life. Before then, I don't think I could have identified with his problems, Bobby says. I never really understood what Danny was going through. A lot of people in the area who wanted to see me do well didn't always give Danny a full chance to succeed. The expectations were ridiculous for him. What Danny needed was for us to be spaced out 3 or 4 years instead of 18 months. Then things might have been different for him. By December 11, 1993, Danny had stopped going to class, moved out of his dorm room, and finally had it publicly declared that he would take a leave of absence from the team. On December 12, Bobby had his car accident, and his parents rushed off to Sacramento to nurse him back to health. As one family put it, quote, Danny couldn't even have a tragedy to himself, end quote. Reaching his brother's side in California, Danny was inconsolable in the hospital room, sitting and crying for hours. Danny tried to understand why it wasn't him in the bed, why God had chosen this to happen to Bobby. This was the wrong Hurley son, Danny cried. I was just the guy who couldn't even finish his college career without quitting, Danny would later say. I felt so worthless. With his parents staying in Sacramento with Bobby, Danny, on leave at Seton Hall, helped coach the St. Anthony team. When he finally came home, Bob Hurley was so run down that he eventually contracted pneumonia. So Danny took over the St. Anthony team with George Kanda, his father's assistant, and coached them until Bob was well enough to take over again. Carlesimo left for the Portland Trailblazers before the start of Danny's senior season at Seton Hall, replaced with an old Jersey City playground legend, George Blaney, whom Bob Hurley had grown up idolizing. He was a kind, soft-spoken man, the perfect tonic for Carlesimo's hard-driving ways. Danny finished his career at Seton Hall with a strong senior season, restored with a new-found self-worth beyond basketball. He curbed the nightlife, earned his degree, and passed on chances to play pro ball in Europe to get into teaching and coaching. 2 years after graduation, Danny joined the coaching staff at Rutgers, where Kevin Banyan had been hired as head coach to invigorate a perpetually downtrodden program. One of the biggest problems for Rutgers had been convincing the rich talent base of recruits in New Jersey to stay home and play for the state university. For the most part, Rutgers was a school synonymous with failure. The hiring of a Hurley son was the next best thing to getting Bob himself to take the Big East job, which was never happening. Bannon believed Danny could get his father to send some top St. Anthony's recruits to Rutgers, something that had happened just twice in a quarter century. What's more, the Hurley name would have credibility recruiting up and down the eastern seaboard. Danny was a better coach than anyone on the staff, says ex-Rutgers assistant Rob Lanier, now head coach at Siena College. He was young, just out of college, and most of us had been in the profession for a few years. But all his life, he had so many things ingrained in him from one of the best basketball minds in the world. Nobody taught the game better than him. Nobody thought it better than him. From a technical standpoint, he was far superior to the rest of us. It wasn't long before Hurley and Lanier realized they had misjudged their wisdom in hitching their coaching careers to Bannon. He turned out to be a grown-up frat boy using the perks of his job to make it one big party weekend. Yet, it wasn't all immature revelry. Some of the behavior was downright disturbing. Actually, the incident most connected to Bannon's fourth season at Rutgers would end up a Trivial Pursuit question. What school's head coach held a naked free throw shooting contest? The answer was Rutgers, where, as young assistant coaches, Danny and Lanier were so mortified they had to walk out of the gym as Bannon encouraged his players to take off an article of clothing for every missed shot. At the end, 2 players and 2 student managers had to run naked sprints in the arena. Lawsuits were eventually filed. The whole time I'm thinking, how am I going to tell my father about this? Danny says. His own college playing career had torn away a good deal of his idealistic beliefs about the business of big-time basketball, but his experiences at Rutgers obliterated the rest. In the end, Danny found a perverse sort of satisfaction in the way the Rutgers program imploded. Bannon was fired in 2001. Danny lost his job in the head coaching changeover, the best thing that ever happened to him, he believes. In his mind, it saved him from a college fast-track life that would have demanded constant travel and strains on his family. He had been brought up to have a father home for dinner at night, the way his dad had with his own father. The first year of my son's life, it was just horrible, Danny says. At first, I would come home and see him do things that he hadn't been doing when I left for a trip, and then I would start coming home, pick him up, and he didn't know who I was. By being a college coach, I was being a worse dad than mine was for me. You want to be a better dad than your father was, and that was hard. I wasn't exactly traveling around the world doing God's work either. I was traveling around making nice money and basically being a salesman. It was pretty pathetic. My father didn't just have a job, but did a service to the community. He reached the hardest of souls in his job in probation. He saved so many of our friends growing up in Jersey City, guys who had parents who were in AA or on drugs or not around at all. For me, it had a profound impact, and it's a lot of the reason I struggled at the college level. I listened to him too much. I was probably destined to coach high school because I spent so much time listening to him. He found peace of mind as a high school coach, turning St. Benedict's Prep, a boarding school in Newark, into a national power. He teaches history, coaches basketball, and brings his players into his family, the way his father had with the St. Anthony's kids. His roster includes kids from Puerto Rico, Africa, the Dominican Republic, and points up and down the East Coast. The St. Benedict's players come home to freehold with Danny on the weekends, eating dinner with his family and doing homework at his kitchen table. When I was burying my head on the desk at Rutgers, I didn't realize what I was missing. I didn't realize the feeling that you got when one of your high school players calls you from college and tells you how great it is and how much maybe you affected his life getting there. That's what I learned from my dad. That's why college coaching sucked for me. It was just a business. It was misery because it's everything that's anti-Bob. Danny takes money out of his pocket to buy his foreign players clothes when they have nothing to wear in the winter. He woke up at 4 o'clock during the season to monitor the team's morning study hall. He never rules out the possibility of coaching in college again, but he has a good life at St. Benedict's. Danny Hurley found a place he can make a difference, a place where he figures he probably belonged the whole time. I always thought Bobby and me maximized ourselves. It was meant for him to be a first-round pick, make a ton of money, and play in the NBA. It was meant for me to be a coach, to try and do some of the things that my dad did, said Danny. No, it was never easy being Danny Hurley. Along the way, the more Danny discovered Danny for himself, it got easier all the time. My name is Ed Fang, your host for the Football Analytics Show. I'm sure I broke every copyright law on the books in bringing you that chapter of the miracle of St. Anthony, so I hope you enjoyed it. And hopefully Woj doesn't sue me for this episode, because I think his book is the best sports book I have ever read. Period. Bob Hurley Sr. is a fantastic coach and teacher, and he won countless New Jersey State championships at St. Anthony. But the book is more compelling because of his flaws. His old school approach includes yelling and challenging his players to fights. No joke and no takers. In addition, the stories about the overbearing basketball mom and the player who got kicked off the team before the state playoffs make the book an incredible read. If you're looking for a fantastic book, check out Woj's The Miracle of St. Anthony. Thanks for listening. My name is Ed Fang, your host. We will be digging into college basketball for the next month on this podcast. If you want to win your March Madness pool, sign up for my free sports betting newsletter. To check it out, go to thepowerrank.com.